Okay, hi everybody. So my name is Lizzy. I am the Adult Services Manager at the North Riverside Public Library, and I am coming to you for this week's Talented Tuesday, which is a series we do where our staff show off a new skill they've been learning during quarantine and teach it to you. This week we're gonna switch it up just a little bit because instead of talking about a new skill that I've been teaching myself, I'm actually gonna talk about an old skill that I have. Which is how to tell if a book is rare and potentially worth some money for you to sell it online or anywhere else. And the reason I have this skill is because before I became a librarian, I used to be the assistant manager at a nonprofit bookstore in Chicago called Open Books. And all of the books that we received at Open Books were donated to us, and we sold them to fund literacy programs that Open Books continues to run. They're a really, really great organization. So we had hundreds of donated books coming in every day, and every once in a while we would get something rare. And so we would sell them on eBay or in the store. And I got really good at deciphering very quickly the type of book that might be worth looking into a little bit more to see if it was actually potentially worth a little bit of money. And so that's just kind of a skill that I built up over that time, and it has stayed with me, and that I'm kind of excited to share with you all today. So instead of actually showing you how to create something or do a task, I'm going to be largely talking to you today about what the process is, but I do have quite a few props to kind of show you. So I'm going to move the phone a little bit so you can see my book stack that we're going to be talking about. These are all from my personal collection. So, all right. So generally, rare books, in my opinion, fall into two types. You have your old rare books, which are can range from what are called incunabula, which are from like the first 50 years after the printing press was discovered. So we're talking the 1400s, probably all the way to the 1600s, the 1700s, or the 18th century. You start to see more and more mass printing, and so you might not consider those old anymore. It starts to get into modern territory. And then there are modern rare books, which are anything probably from, I would say, definitely the 19th century to today for book collectors. And so that can range from something from like the 1920s or something that was published 5 years ago could be considered a modern rare book as well. So I'm going to talk about both types a little bit today. The first major thing you need to know is that it really comes down to research. So I thought that this might be a good Talented Tuesday to do right now because everybody's kind of stuck at home and they may be going through their collections and pulling stuff to get rid of. Or, you might be going through a loved one's collection to help them clear out their house and they might not realize what they have. So this is kind of a good opportunity for you, in my viewpoint, to kind of, as you're going through the books, pull aside. I'm going to teach you which ones to kind of pay attention to do research on later. So I'm not going to tell you which specific books are rare, but more what your guideposts are to look for to say, hey, this one's interesting. I'm going to do some research on it. And hey, this one's probably not. I'm just going to put it aside and donate it or something like that. So research is really key, and that's what it comes down to. When I'm doing my research for rare books, there's a website I use called bookfinder.com. When I'm done talking, I will put the link in the description or in the chat, in the comments. And in bookfinder.com, when you go there and search for a specific book, you will see everybody on the internet on like maybe 100, 200 different websites, everybody who's selling that edition of that book. And you will see a real crazy range of prices usually. There are stories about, like, there was a news story a few years back where somebody was trumpeting from the hills that your old Disney VHS tapes were worth thousands of dollars. And the reason they were saying that was because that somebody on eBay had listed some old Disney VHS tapes for thousands of dollars. But that doesn't mean they're worth that much or that anybody will ever pay that much. The fact that somebody put that price on an eBay listing doesn't actually mean it'll sell. So what you really want to be paying to is sold listings, and you want to be paying attention to the aggregate of prices. So you might see 10 or 15 different prices, and you want to kind of take the range and see what something's worth. So that's my disclaimer as far as research goes. So when it comes to old books, the things that you're going to want to pay attention to are the binding, the importance whether it is a genuine first edition and whether it's part of a set and whether that set is important or interestingly bound. Now, unfortunately for really old books, I don't have examples to show you because I don't own anything that's really, really old or very, very expensive, because that's often where the really big money in book collecting can be. So I'm just going to talk to you about kind of what to look for. A lot of talking. So the binding, you want leather bound, and if it's gilded or by a famous binder, the binder will usually be listed in the book. That's important. So for leather bound, there's two types of leather bound. I do have an example of this, so these books aren't old. This book is leather bound all the way around, full leather binding, and it's gold gilt. So that's, or gilt inlay, which is really nice. This one is what's called a quarter bound, and that's because just this part is leather and the rest of the book is something else. They have marbling in the end pages. Again, this is not a old book, but in a really older book, if you see this really cool type of marbling, and if it's a full leather binding or even a quarter leather binding, it's a lot more likely to be worth a little bit of money, because that's kind of the type of thing that lasts in good condition, and maybe by a famous binder, especially when it's that old. The importance is really important. If you get an author who is really major writing in this 17th century, and of course I'm kind of going blank on, let's say, when was Victor Hugo publishing? A really major, super famous author, and you have an early edition, a first edition, or an edition by a really important printing press that did interesting illustrations or a really interesting binding, that is likely to be collectible. So if you are seeing books in your family's home like that, put them aside and do some research on them for sure. If you have a set of books, that's a really common thing to see in older books. Especially not that old, but from say the 19th century, you'll get sets of books, 10, 15 books. If your set is complete, it's likely to be worth a little bit more money. If it's leather bound, it's definitely going to be worth some money. If it's incomplete, if it's not leather bound, the odds are it's probably not really worth anything. People get really excited when they see those sets, but the truth is that they tend not to be worth anything. You can pull it aside and look. And research a little bit, but my experience is you're not going to get a ton from that. So that's a little bit about the older book, but I will say the older it is, I wouldn't get rid of it. If it's from the 16th or 17th or even 18th century, keep that and do some research on it. That's a lot more rare than books from the 18th and 19th and of course 20th centuries. And that's what I'm going to talk to you most about today, because those are the ones that I have examples for that I can actually show you. So as far as modern, rare, or books that'll have a good price on the secondary market, the things that you're going to be looking for are the importance of the work, whether it's a first edition, whether it's signed, whether there might be an important misprint, whether it's kind of from a collector's collection, or whether it's a book club edition. So let's start with first editions. I have some books here that are first editions and some books that aren't, so I can kind of show you what to look for. I'm going to kind of clear off my space a little bit so you guys can see what I'm talking about. When you're trying to decipher if a book is a first edition, there is the one place you're going to look, and that is the title page. So I'm going to turn my camera around so you can actually be looking at the book. So this is my copy of Good Omens. This is a first edition. This is a really important book to me. It's one of my favorite books of all time. And the place that you're going to want to look to discover what type of book you have is the title page. Oh, so this is signed. The title page is this page that has just all this publisher's information on it. And what you're going to be looking at is right here, first printing September 1990, and then this number line that starts at 10 and goes all the way down to 1. So when I say first edition, I realize I've been saying that all along. When I say first edition, I don't actually mean first edition. I mean first printing of the first edition, or first impression of the first edition, because books will be published in multiple multiple printings. So like the first printing sells out, they'll print a second printing, but it will still be the first edition unless something in the text changes. The only thing that will really ever be valuable is the first printing of the first edition, almost always. So what you want is, number one, if it says first printing, you're golden. It usually won't say that though. Usually what's going to happen is the number line is going to go all the way down to 1. If you don't see a 1 on the number line, that usually means it's not a first printing. So here's an example of what you might see when you would think it would be a first edition, first printing, but it's not. So this is my copy of Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book, which is another book that I really love. And in the title page, you're gonna see, look there, it says first edition. So you might be thinking, oh my God, this is a first edition of a Neil Gaiman book. That's really great. But look at the number line. There's no 1 anywhere on it. 20, 19, 18, 17, all the way down to 12. And on the other side, you go down to 9. That means this is probably a 9th printing of the first edition. That tends to mean it's not rare. It's probably not worth anything at all. The signed factor definitely helps it. But a signed first printing of a first edition is going to be worth a lot more than a signed 8th printing or 9th printing of a first edition. So that's the type of thing when you are clearing out your house and you're like, this is a pretty famous book and it looks like it might be a first edition. Oh my God, it says first edition on the title page. Woo, I'm rich. If the number line doesn't go all the way to 1, you don't really have anything. So you want to be paying close attention to that. Now, there are exceptions to that rule, and I actually have an exception here. So this is my first edition of another one of my favorite books, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. And this book is a first edition, but the number line doesn't go down to 1. It stops at first. It says first edition. It doesn't say first printing anywhere. And the number line doesn't go to 1. So most people would see this book and say, okay, this is a second printing of the first edition. That's too bad. I don't have a real first. That's what they call it. What's a first printing of a first edition? It's called a first. This is probably the second printing. So that is actually, however, not true, because the publisher of this particular book published the first printing without the number line saying 1. And the only way you would know that would be to go on the internet and type in and say, like, how do I know if I have a first edition of Cavalier and Clay? And they'll give you like what they call first edition markers. And one of the first edition markers is the price on the dust jacket. Should be that specific price. There's a specific fact that there's no quotes on the dust jacket. There are quotes in the second printing. And in fact, that the publisher printed it this way. Oh my gosh. Anyway, printed it without the number line saying 1. So there's an exception to almost every rule. Gosh, if I could actually get to the right page. Yes, so there's no 1 here. If there's an exception to almost every rule in book collecting, and that's why you really need to do your research. Another question that's pretty common is, what if there's no dust jacket? So I could have this first edition of The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay missing its dust jacket. And I might be like, woo, okay, I've got a first edition. This is definitely a first edition, first printing. It's got to be worth some money. This book won the Pulitzer. It's like a big deal. Famous author. Well, no, if it doesn't have the dust jacket, it loses about 80% of its value. And if the dust jacket's in bad condition, it loses about 80% of its value. So that's really something you want to be paying close attention to. And if you're a book collector, or if you think you want to be a book collector, never get rid of a dust jacket. It's painful to see. Okay. So those are books that are really recent. Like The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay was published in like 2001 or 2003. Good Omens was the 80s. The Graveyard Book was the 2010s. But modern books can also be like, say, from the 20s. So this here is A Movable Feast by Ernest Hemingway. That's another really beautiful book about his time in Paris. I'm not usually a Hemingway fan, but I loved this particular book by him. It's got its dust jacket. It's a gorgeous dust jacket. And if you open it up, you are going to see on the title page, not too much. Okay, so what's interesting here is that books that are basically before the 80s aren't going to have that number line, and they're not going to have necessarily like a ton of information that you might see in a more recent book. They'll have a Library of Congress catalog card number. That means it was published in 1964, if you see a 6-4 there. And you'll see a copyright date. Sometimes you'll see first edition and sometimes you won't. So for books that are older, like modern books that are older, you actually do need to do quite a bit of research to see if they're first edition. Now, if you did the research on this one, you would see that a first edition of A Movable Feast basically has just this information on it, and you'd be really excited. However, this is not actually a first edition, even though it has the first edition markers, because what it also has is the book club markers. Book of the month, club selection. So this is a book club book. Book club books were published at the exact same time as a first printing of a first edition. Sometimes they were even printed before the first printing that went to the book trade, to the bookstores. But they're worth like, I don't know, like a tenth of the price or less, because they're not printed on paper that it will last as long. The book jackets aren't printed on paper that's as nice. They're more likely to rip. And also, like, real book collectors want the trade edition. They don't want the book club editions. So another way you can tell that is usually, actually I didn't check before this if this book has it. Yeah, there's a little tiny marker. Can you guys see that? There's a little tiny marker right there in the back corner when you take the dust jacket off. If you see a marker like that, that's a book club book. Not worth that much. Still worth looking up. I think this book would probably be worth like $15, but if it wasn't a book club book, it might be worth a couple hundred. So, you know, that's a bummer, but it's still really cool to own. All right, so that is kind of the main things you want to think about with sort of like major books in hardcover by like really big deal authors. That's what you want to look for. But there are a few other things that you might want to look for too if you're going through your books or your family's books. And those are like major important series or publishers. So an example of an important series that could be worth a little bit of money is modern library books. Modern library books are really big collector's items. So if you see like a pretty major book like Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, obviously like is a pretty famous poem, majorly famous author. And this is a modern library book from, probably 1973. Let's see if we go to the title page. From no year. Interesting. Yeah, there's not always a ton of information that you'd expect. That's why doing research is so important. But based on this, I'm going to say it was the 70s. So anyway, if it's a modern library book, or if you see a book that has some sort of logo on the spine that shows you that it's part of a series or a collection by a publisher that, publish, multiple ones, like G50 is a number, which means there's probably a G49, and Modern Library Giant. So Modern Library is the press, and this is one of their books. So that is going to all imply to you that this particular book is part of a series by a publisher, and collectors go for that type of thing. So that is a sign that this could be worth a little bit of money, and you should look it up. Another type of book that could be worth a little bit of money is anything leather-bound. Now, this is not an old book. This is Leave It to Smith by P.G. Wodehouse, another one of my absolute all-time favorite authors. And it's a collector's edition, bound in genuine leather. That's going to pique your interest, by the Easton Press. Now, Easton Press is a major publisher of collector's books. They do leather. They do literally gold gilding inlay. They do acid-free paper. Collectors really like the Eastern editions. And so if you have an Easton edition, this is you're not going to, unless it's something major like Shakespeare, like if you have Shakespeare like a complete Shakespeare Easton edition, maybe you're going to get $100 for it. This Leave It to Smith, probably $30 or $40. But $30 or $40 is still a pretty nice chunk of change. And that's really because it's leather bound. You might also see something like this. This is my copy of The Trial of Lizzy Borden, which, my name is Lizzy Bowden, so I feel like I have a kinship with her. Sometimes you got to get some people with an axe. Not fully leather bound, but quarter leather bound, so that's still quite nice. And this is so it's got like an interesting note in here, I just completely blanked on what the name of these are, with Ex Libris in here. Ex Libris of somebody whose name is blacked out. I got this used, but it's from the Notable Trials Library. So if you look this up, it's been privately printed for members of the Notable Trials Library. So this also might be a collector's edition. This might be something a collector would want. Like maybe they're collecting all of the books from the Notable Trials Library and you happen to have one. You'd probably get 40 or maybe 50 bucks for this book because of that fact. Another time that I sold a book, I'm gonna go to my face for this. One of the times that was like my greatest success selling at Open Books was when we got this little tiny book of poetry in. It was called A Handbook for Witches. And I looked at it and I was like, God, this looks like kind of a nothing little book. This is this tiny little handbook for witches of like kind of bad poetry. No offense to the author. It wasn't all bad. It wasn't my taste. But then I looked closer and it was published by a press called Arkham House Press. Now, Arkham House Press is a really small publisher. They publish like 5 books a year, and collectors collect every Arkham House Press title. And I looked it up, so I saw, oh, Arkham House Press. Let me look up this book and see what it is. So that particular book was published by Arkham House Press as a favor to a friend of one of the publishers. So this was one of the 5 books that year that they published, just because the publisher knew the woman who wrote it. They only published 500 copies. And so collectors of Arkham House Press titles go wild for A Handbook for Witches because it's really hard to find. There were only 500 copies ever printed. So we had that. It was actually signed by the author. So I thought, okay, this is a part of a collector's press. This is a really hard book to find. So like collectors of the press, it doesn't come up for sale very often. I put it on eBay and it went for $1,000. Which was nuts to me. Like that was insane. It's not the type of thing that usually happens, but like you want to pay attention to the publisher too, because there are a lot of small vanity presses out there that collectors want. So that's the type of thing you're looking for. Now I will also just say really quickly, just as a caution to you, that the fact that it is a first edition, a first printing of a first edition of a really notable work does not inherently mean it's worth a lot of money. So as an example, and I wish I'd pulled it before because it's like behind a lot of books on my bookshelf. But as an example, the 4th Harry Potter book, a first printing of the first edition of the 4th Harry Potter book, Goblet of Fire, is not worth anything at all, or maybe like 20 bucks. And the reason for that is because they printed millions of them. I think the first print run of a Goblet of Fire was probably 2 or 3 million. So it's not rare. Like everybody can have one if they want one. But a first printing of the first edition of the Sorcerer's Stone, or like God forbid you have a first printing of the first edition of the Philosopher's Stone printed at first in the UK, then you're looking at like really big money, like thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, because there were only 5,000 printed. And so it's really hard for collectors to get their hands on. So rarity really, really matters. Also important misprints matter. So for example, in the 3rd Harry Potter book, also had a pretty large print run. So a first printing of the first edition of A Prisoner of Azkaban is not worth that much money because Harry Potter was already really popular by that time. So they did a pretty big print run. However, the first few hundred books that came off the printing press had a misprint on the title page where it said Joanne Rowling instead of J.K. Rowling. So if you have a version of The Prisoner of Azkaban, it's the first edition of the first printing, that says Joanne Rowling, then that's pretty big money. But if it says J.K. Rowling, even though it's a first printing of the first edition, it's not, because there were way more of those printed than the Joanne Rowling version, if that makes sense. So that's the type of thing you kind of want to look out for when you're looking for rare books, and that you really want to be paying attention to. So if you just see like an old book, like, okay, like this is an old book, the New Antoinette Pope Cookbook, cool, it's old, like I like it. This isn't worth anything, just by inherent value of it being kind of older. What matters is what it means to a collector. So first printing of first editions, if it's part of a collector's press like Easton Edition or Arkham House, if it's signed, if it's the first printing of a first edition signed by the major author, then it's likely to be worth something. But a second printing of a first edition, not so much. A book club book, not so much. So I hope this has been helpful. And if you are going through your house and you're seeing a lot of old books and you're kind of wondering, hey, is this something I should research? I hope this has given you some guidance. And if you have further questions after listening to this, go ahead and add them in the comments. I will be paying attention to the comments and I'll answer them if I can. But the major thing is really just to do research. If you have something that kind of pings your brain and says, this might be worth something, go to bookfinder.com, type it in, and see what other people are selling it for online, because you never really know. So thanks very much, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your week.